So the first design are those descriptive methods. We'll talk about case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and more. So the purpose is to describe something, that first goal of developmental psychology. And for this class, we're going to be talking about 5 types of descriptive methods: case studies, observation, surveys, psychophysiological measures, and microdata. The last one is not in your book, but I want to bring it forward anyhow. So first, a case study. So a case study is in-depth examination of one or a few individuals who share a common characteristic. And I say individuals rather than subjects because the cases could be individuals or it could be organizations. So I think I have some examples coming up here. Example might be you are interested in studying 5 people who are deemed very happy by their peers, to see what their lives involve, to learn about them in depth. Or, let's see if we can have an organizational one. Just going back to this organization, you might also be interested in studying, say, 5 schools or 3 schools that were very successful in turning around math achievement for their students. And so you might go into the schools, and those would be your cases. So what kind of data would you gather? Well, if you're studying individuals, you might have interview data from their family, teachers. You might interview the subjects. You might look back at their school records and their medical records. You might look at their correspondence, letters that they've written, or nowadays we could include their social media posts and things like that. You might go and look around their home. You might look at old journals and things like that. So you'd be gathering a lot of different data. And if your subjects are organizations, you might be going into them and talking to students, visiting classrooms, looking at the facilities, looking at the individuals, speaking to the leaders and the school board and the community and so forth. But you can see that you're gathering a lot of different types of data for a case study. The problem with it is that it's not generalizable. And it means that you couldn't take the things you learn here and apply it to anyone else besides these individuals that you'd studied. And in research, we usually want to be able to apply our findings more broadly. Some examples of case studies. This particular book I read in my graduate program. It's called Promises I Can Keep. And this was a case study of women who had children before they were married, and they were trying to understand what the lives were of these women before they had their children and after. And they turned it into a book. A lot of time case studies are turned into books. Here's another one, Unequal Childhoods. And this person sent her students out to kind of live with families, or at least to spend longer periods of time with families, some of whom were kind of rich and some of whom were not rich, to find out the different ways that the children were raised in those families. And this book, another one focused on, these were from kind of the sociology emphasis of my graduate work, or this one was from my undergraduate work. But in this case, the cases were schools, and Jonathan Kozel went into the schools that were usually in city areas less than a mile apart, but one was very, very poor and one was very, very rich. And this very dramatic book highlighted the differences between those schools done through observation. So you can see these aren't research articles, these are actual books that people buy, and often that's the way these are studied. We'll also be working, you can see at the bottom here, Terman's termites. This is a researcher, Dr. Terman, who they just joked around and called them termites, but he found some children who were identified as highly gifted at a very young age, and he followed them throughout their lifespan, and those were his cases. The second method is observation, and this is observation of subjects or participants in a natural or in a lab setting to learn about behaviors and attitudes or whatever the researcher is interested in studying. An example of naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation takes place in just a natural setting. So it's almost like the researcher is just observing without being a part of the group. One study that I found interesting was a researcher who observed boys and girls' playground behavior without interacting with those children. So just kind of observing them in the playground, and the researcher was interested in whether boys and girls had different play patterns. This was way back in the 1950s. A second method is laboratory observation. An example of this is Ainsworth's strange situation. So laboratory doesn't necessarily mean like a lab with vials and chemicals. It just means a controlled setting. And so people come into a controlled setting to be exposed to certain prescribed phenomena. And in that situation, the observation of their behaviors in the lab are watched through, let's say, a two-way mirror or through a camera or something like that. But the situation is controlled. It's not natural, and that's why it's called a lab. And finally, participatory observation. In this case, we have someone participating in a natural setting while they observe. An example might be a classroom teacher who's observing and documenting habits of outbursts in a child, a child that might be having difficulty, and the teacher might be teaching the class and at the same time observing and documenting the behavior. So they're participating while observing. So some challenges with this, 3 that we'll identify. One is the observer effect, or called the Hawthorne effect, or a lab effect, and that's that people might not behave the same as they would normally behave if they're being observed. The second is that the incident of interest might not happen very often. And so let's say someone is interested in observing people's reactions to a natural disaster. Well, they would have to wait for a natural disaster, and that might be a challenge. And finally, we can't identify causation, which is usually what we want to do. We want to know whether one factor causes another, but we can't do that in this situation. It's just descriptive research. The Hawthorne effect, the understanding that observation changes behaviors, was found in a situation where scientists came in and observed workers who were interested in whether the lighting in the room affected how well the workers worked. And they found that, in essence, while the workers were being observed, their performance improved, and that they couldn't identify or tease out the effects of the lighting. And so in order to observe people, we really have to be around steadily enough or invisible enough that people forget they're being observed or become unaware that they're being observed. And that can happen over time. If the person is a constant present in the classroom, they will no longer be aware of, and the natural behaviors will start to occur. A third method is surveys. Self-report on a variety of topics. Typically, a survey gets a sample of people. So they can't get the entire population, which means every individual in the group. Instead, they just get a sample to represent that population. So if we're interested in the opinions of all the Navajo people, the best way to do it would be to put all the names of all those people in a hat and then pull out a certain number of them and see that they take the survey. So we have formal and informal surveys. In the sciences, we'd be going with the formal surveys, but newspapers and magazines do informal surveys where they just write up good questions, make guesses at what would be good, and let anyone who wants to fill it out. But formal surveys, like a questionnaire measuring your personality trait or something like that, your intelligence, the questions would be very carefully considered and tested to make sure that they're valid, that they're measuring what they should measure. This is put up here as an example of an informal survey, and I put it here because you can imagine that if you had to answer questions about your sex life, that you might run into some problems. So first off, one problem might have is called non-response bias. So who's going to choose to answer this survey? Well, probably people who are having some sort of, questions around their sex life. You can also think of this if you've ever been in a restaurant where they had a little card on the table that invited you to give your feedback about the service. Well, those who respond are usually the ones who had a really bad experience or a really good experience. But regardless, not everyone responds, and non-response bias suggests that those who don't answer the survey are different from those who do answer the survey. So that's why we are usually very careful with our sampling. Secondly, there might be a desire to please the researcher. So if I, as your faculty, survey you as students, you might write down what you think I want to hear. If I survey you about, for example, how well you like the class, you might want to please me and say, yes, you really like the class. And so that's another tendency that we have to be careful with when we do surveys. Thirdly, honesty. This Babbel.com survey might lead people to be less than honest, maybe because they're embarrassed, or maybe because they have something they're ashamed of. But for whatever reason, people might not respond honestly to a survey. And then finally, some samples might not be representative of the population. We always have to make sure that we're sampling everyone equally in the population. But for example, when we take our census in this country, it can be very hard to include people who are homeless in the sample. And that means that the sample is not representative of the population, and that can be a problem. So we have to take good care with our surveys. A fourth method is psychophysiological assessment. And we can learn a lot about psychology by studying physiological indicators. For example, heart rate, given a level, might indicate a certain level of arousal. We can measure skin conductance, also a measure of stress, sort of the sweat that's on someone's skin, suggestive maybe that they're anxious about something. Heart rate variability is a measure of one's ability to be adaptive and resilient to a situation. Brain activity can be measured through, say, EEG, like in this top picture, and we can see what sort of surface level indicators are present, or an MRI might give us information about the deeper activity levels in the brain. So there are a lot of things we can learn about psychology by taking physiological measures. And in the past, typically these measures had to be done with special instruments in a lab or an office or something, But now, a lot of these data can be gathered through devices people wear all the time, like smartwatches, Fitbits, even your phone. There are suggestions in this little image that your eyeglasses or a hat could have some sort of data measuring maybe brain neural indicators or pulse or something like that. That a shirt or a sports bra could tight around your chest could be used to measure heart rate or to measure other indicators of your overall level of arousal. Armbands could be used, bracelets, watches, rings, even socks. All of those can measure things like your respiratory breathing rate or how you're sleeping or your pulse rate. And all of these things really are impactful on psychology. In general, we can learn a lot. So this is a direction you'll probably see in your lifetime. Method 5, microdata, that I included but is not included in your book, is really being used all the time right now. So it's tiny pieces of technological information gathered from how you use your technology. So for example, how many microseconds do you hover over an image or page? If you hover over it just a little bit longer, the algorithm that's making decisions about marketing is going to start to want to sell you something related to that image or give you more posts like that. What do you click on? That's an even more reliable indicator. How and when do you use your phone? At what time of day are you most likely to buy something? All these are used to target advertising. What kinds of things do you search? How often, and a little bit different, these are all technologically phone and computer based, but what about this? If you have a newer car, there's all kinds of technology embedded that things like warn you if you are going out of your lane, or all alert you if there's someone behind you or in your blind spot. And even there's eye tracking technology in your vehicle to tell if your eyes are off the road, all kinds of things like this. And these data are really, there was even a lawsuit because GE was using these to set your insurance rates. That they can no longer do that. That's not legal. But these are the kinds of data that are available, and even your GPS tracking, where do you go? So all of these things are examples of data or microdata gathered through your use of technology that can be used to describe you and learn about individual habits or your personality. So those are the 5 types of data we consider in descriptive research. There are a couple of questions here. Jenna, a graduate student, is interested in children's cross-gender play habits. She works at a daycare and decides to gather data by observing children while she's working. What is this type of study? Well, this is a participant observation because she is gathering data while she's working, while she's participating. And next, Dr. Andrews studied children's affect after prolonged periods of screen time and conducted a scientific study to examine the phenomenon. Before the study can be accepted for publication, it must go through and the answer is a peer review process, meaning that experts in the field have to review his methods. And the last one, sometimes the people who respond to a research survey are in some way different from those who do not respond to the survey, and thus might produce answers that are different from the population as a whole. This phenomenon is called, and this is a non-response bias, meaning the non-respondents have a bias that the respondents don't have, or vice versa.